On April 6 and 7 of 1862, the Battle of Shiloh, also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, was fought. Carnage was unprecedented, with the human toll being the greatest of any war in America up to that date. There were about 23,746 casualties. Of those, 2,409 were from Iowa. There are gravestones, but no one really knows where the soldiers are, as they were buried where they fell in battle. This is the story about the Civil War and how it affected Iowa and Pella.
We're sitting here today in the personal office of Dominie Henry Peter Scholte. This is communications central for Pella during the war years. Scholte wrote all of his mail from this office, answering mail he received, and responded. So he was in contact with so much of the American world from this very office. During the campaigns of 1860 and 1864, he was very active in all of the state here activities in Pella, and this is the office from which he operated. Here to my right is his desk. This is important because this was the location of all of his writing activity. Every day he kept a journal of his financial affairs and the letters he received and the letters he sent out in his journals, and it occurred right here at this desk. It's wonderful that we have this office. It was an addition to the house in 1853, and his office was here after that time. Downstairs, before you went up the Dutch staircase straight up, was a waiting room for those who wanted to see the Dominie. They would be brought up here and they would sit here and he would deal with them on all kinds of issues. Scholte left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party. And so much of his activity here during the war came about because of his political connection. The campaign of 1860 was one of the nation's most crucial campaigns. In those months just before war broke out in April of 1861. And Scholte went to the Republican State Convention in Des Moines. He was selected as a delegate to the National Republican Convention that would meet in Chicago in May of 1860. And he was, in fact, the vice president of that convention, chosen because of his immigrant connections. Lincoln hoped to attract the votes of the Dutch and the Germans in that election, and Scholte was a part of Lincoln's vision of attracting that element of voting. Scholte declared that the present condition of our country cannot but attract the attention of every thoughtful citizen. He warned the president of radical abolitionists. I consider it a great calamity for our country if the present Democratic Party should gain the ascendancy. Scholte believed that Lincoln was, quote, an anti-slavery man like myself, but unwilling to destroy society by trying impracticable theories like the abolitionists. He warned President Lincoln, "I'm convinced that if the war is not prosecuted with the utmost vigor, the South will be recognized by European powers and our nationality at an end." Scholte's trip to Lincoln's inauguration in March, or actually February of 1860, at least 100 Iowans joined the vast Republican throng and descended on Washington, D.C. for Lincoln's inauguration. And Scholte was there. He stayed at the Willard Hotel near the White House, where he had stayed a year before. And there, the very evening of his arrival on February 25, he attended a reception of, as he wrote in his journal, "Lincoln and Lady." 2 days later, on February 27, Scholte joined the Iowa congressional delegation for a visit with the president-elect, again at Willard's. Scholte's next few days before the inauguration were quiet, but on March 4, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated President of the United States, and Scholte was there. There were 30,000 gathered to hear Lincoln's inaugural address. And the amazing thing is, because of his high-pitched voice, he can be heard by a vast number of that large audience. So Scholte clearly, probably on the platform, could hear Lincoln's speech. On March 11 of 1861, he sat down and wrote a letter of appreciation to his friend Lincoln, and the next day, on March 12 of 1861, he left by train for St. Louis and on home to Pella. He arrived home on March 17, 1861, almost a month short by 2 days. And during the following year, Scholte continued his correspondence. During those years of war, H.P. Scholte continued to carry on his correspondence with a much beleaguered president. None of Lincoln's letters to Scholte have survived in Pella, but there still remains 5 copies of Scholte's letters to Lincoln, 2 of which he kept for his own reference. Scholte's letter to Lincoln regarding Simon Cameron, as I mentioned, is housed in the Abraham Lincoln Papers in the Library of Congress. That letter was dated January 8, 1861. But in a letter from Pella, written probably sometime in 1861, on August 8, 1861, Lincoln sent another letter to Lincoln. He began, "Since your inauguration of your administration, I have followed closely the history of our country." Notice, he said the history of our country, including himself. And then he observed, "During my stay in Washington, I soon discovered that your administration was surrounded by great greedy office seekers, and the means to obtain success was not much different from former Democratic administrations. And I must say, I turned in disgust from our national capital." That was his reaction of being in Washington at the time of the inauguration. He counseled, "Dear sir, your present position is one of the most difficult and critical of the world. But if you put your trust in God, He will give you wisdom and strength to hold the helm of our ship of state with a strong hand." In those dark days of 1860, of Union losses, Scholte continued his correspondence with Secretary of State Seward about legal matters. But on July 17, 1862, right here at this desk, he wrote the president a letter. It was less political, and I must say, much warmer than his previous correspondence. He began in that letter, written on this desk, and the acknowledgement of the heavy burden resting at present upon your shoulders, I wish to address you. I wish to address you, he says. Dear sir, in the solitude of my study, I often reflect upon the dangers surrounding you. But I can also assure that my unobserved prayer often rises for you to the throne of grace, for wisdom, discernment, fortitude, and perseverance in the present critical struggle for our national existence. Here, in this room, his office, and at his desk, he's praying for Lincoln. On the same day, as Lincoln's important carriage ride with his department secretaries occurred, he was discussing emancipation of slaves. Lincoln wrote, "Dear Sir, human wisdom cannot save our nation, and you are not unaware that calculations of human wisdom in our difficulties have already oftentimes failed. There is, however, supreme wisdom and power, who will not disappoint any man who puts in reality his trust in him, who can save with few as well as with many." Then Scholte concluded this letter with a prayerful desire for Lincoln's spiritual strength. Dear sir, it is my earnest wish and prayer that you may be strengthened against all pressure of every ultraism, and that you may retain your yet unsullied name and carry through your very dangerous and troublesome administration the very honorable name of honest old Abe. You can rest assured that you have at least in me one praying friend in Iowa. Truly yours, Henry P. Scholte.